Welcome, everybody. This is a panel entitled Grassroots Struggles for Environmental Justice and Equity. Thank you so much for joining us here. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Ayoade Balogun. I'm a junior here at Stanford studying environmental systems engineering and African American studies, and I have been blessed with the honor of moderating this panel of incredible individuals. So the way that this panel will be structured is I will offer brief introductions for our three panelists. Then they will offer opening remarks about their work, their connection to environmental justice. We'll have the panel where we discuss questions about each of their perspectives on environmental justice, how it connects to the legacies of Gandhi and Martin Luther King. And then we'll have some time at the end for questions from the audience. So first, I'd like to introduce Dalila Adofo. Dalila Adofo is a community organizer with Green Action, which is a grassroots organization that is a national leader in challenging government agencies to consider civil rights impacts and to refrain from racially discriminatory permit and regulatory processes and decisions. Dalila is a resident of East Palo Alto, California, and started organizing at the age of 12 when she joined Youth United for Community Action. Dalila was active in the campaigns that closed the Romic hazardous waste plant and in developing the community plan for future use of that site. She has worked with the California Fund for Youth Organizing and helped coordinate and strategize a way for the California Student and Youth Bill of Rights to be passed. She attended and graduated from San Francisco State University with a major in chemistry and a minor in environmental studies. She is a lover of music, poetry, spoken word, lifting weights, and being submerged in nature and being with family. She was a member of Green Action's board of directors for several years and is now the lead coordinator for the Bayview Hunters Point Community Air Monitoring Project. Next, we have Ken Butigan. Ken Butigan is an educator, writer, and advocate for nonviolent change. For 3 decades, he has organized or participated in numerous movements for social transformation, including movements for a nuclear-free future, an end to homelessness, and freedom for East Timor. One of his 6 books, titled Pilgrimage Through a Burning World, Spiritual Practice and Nonviolent Protest at the Nevada Test Site, deals with the eco-justice issues that pertain to the nuclear testing at the U.S. nuclear test site, where nonviolent direct action movements in the 1980s and 90s contributed significantly to achieving the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Ken is the executive director of Pace Yibene Nonviolent Service, which creates educational programming, resources, and action for nonviolent change. He earned his PhD in the Historical and Cultural Studies of Religions at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Ken is currently a senior professional lecturer in DePaul University's Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies program. Next, we have Parwana Ayub. Parwana Ayub is an environmental equity policy fellow at the Green Lining Institute, a policy advocacy organization working to undo the impacts of redlining. Prior to Green Lining, Parwana served as an outreach fellow at Grid Alternatives, where she worked directly with income-qualified families in targeted communities, helping them apply for no-cost solar programs. Parwana graduated from Colby College with a BA in Environmental Policy in 2016. Upon graduation, Parwana was awarded a Watson Fellowship that allowed her to travel the world for a year studying midwifery models of care in historically marginalized communities. Parwana's passion for environmental justice is motivated by her personal history. Growing up in underserved communities in the Bay Area and abroad, Parwana understands that when it comes to addressing environmental issues equitably and inclusively, we must acknowledge their race and class dimensions. So next, I'd like to invite our speakers to do opening remarks, starting with Dalila.
Hello. My bio pretty much sums up most of what I've done. Like Ayoade said, I grew up in East Palo Alto and worked on environmental justice campaigns with Youth United for Community Action. We worked specifically on shutting down Romic, which was a toxic waste plant in East Palo Alto. It was a really negligent facility. It hurt workers. It exploded and caught on fire multiple times. And, you know, East Palo Alto has higher rates of asthma and cancer than the surrounding cities such as Palo Alto and Menlo Park. So yeah, that was something I was really passionate about. I'm an asthmatic myself. So as a young person, little 12-year-old running around, it became really important to me and connected with me through that way. I now work with Green Action for Health and Environmental Justice. I work mainly in Bayview Hunters Point. We work on multiple issues in Bayview Hunters Point regarding the Hunters Point shipyard, which is a radiated naval shipyard. It's closed down now, but they've had an interesting process trying to clean that site up. The company that was supposed to clean it up was actually caught falsifying records, falsifying tests. So we've, as an organization and working with the community to push the retesting and cleanup of that site, since people do still live around that site. I am the lead coordinator for the air monitoring project. So California Air Resources Board granted Green Action and 4 community partners in Bayview Hunters Point to start an air monitoring network. So I kind of coordinate everybody and make sure that project moves forward. I think Bayview's really interesting in regards to that you have residential really, really close to industrial. So you'll have apartments on one side of the street and industry on the other. So measuring particulate matter and stuff like that, I think it will be important to collect that data and have that hopefully move us forward into some policy change, whether it's letting in more industry or more regulation towards industry that's already there, especially given that they're right next to community. So that's pretty much what I do. Gandhi and Martin Luther King are definitely two people that we take the nonviolent civil disobedience really, really seriously, and it drives our work, and we use those tactics often. And so whether it's sit-ins, nonviolent protests, but even the approach of you kind of have to approach your campaign in all different areas, right? So not only are we protesting or sit-ins or something like that, we're also looking at legislation or looking at being there for public comment. So there's so many different effects of you have to approach it through different things. So we take that as well. That's it for me.
Well, it is such a privilege to be here at Stanford at this historic conference. When I think about how yesterday afternoon when I arrived and I saw who's participating and the dinner and then the opening gathering, I felt I'm in heaven. I'm in heaven because I'm with hundreds of people who believe in the power of active, creative, liberating nonviolence for justice, including environmental justice. My name again is Ken Butigan. I work with a small nonprofit organization called Pace Bene, means peace and goodness. It was inspired by St. Francis of Assisi, who used that phrase as a greeting. Pace Bene, peace and goodness. Because even in his day, there wasn't much interest in justice and peace. And he wanted to share that with the world, just in the way that Dr. King and Gandhi have also shared this sentiment with the world. I'll just say a couple of reasons why I think I'm on this panel. The first is, at Pace Bene, we started a project a few years ago called Campaign Nonviolence, which is this audacious vision of how do we work toward a culture of nonviolence free from war, poverty, racism, and environmental destruction, and connecting those dots. And we started with a week of actions every September in 2014 with 240 events. And this past September, just last month, we had 3,314 events in every state across the country and in 25 nations around the world with this thought and hope. Let's build, it may take us 100 years, but let's build a culture of peace and nonviolence. We've done 1,000 nonviolence trainings in this country and around the world. And we also started a project called Nonviolent Cities, where we have about 50 cities in the United States thinking, how can we be a nonviolent Palo Alto or nonviolent Los Angeles or nonviolent New York City or whatever it is. In all of this, we've been inspired by Gandhi and King in very deep ways, and I certainly have since I was in school 30 years ago or so, where I first really was exposed to the philosophy and, more importantly, the practice of active and creative nonviolence. And I would lift up a couple of the principles from King and Gandhi that I think are especially relevant to what we're talking about here today, and certainly the way we've tried to do that at Pace Bene. The first is Dr. King's principle that nonviolence is the love that does justice. So you have love over here and you have justice over here, and sometimes we separate those. And Dr. King smooshed those together. And one of the ways he did that was with his other principle, nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. We're going to try to undermine the evil and injustice in the world, but we're also recognizing that wounded and sacred people are even perpetrating that. So we're not going to seek to destroy those people. What we want to do is destroy the violence. And then in terms of Gandhi, I've always been struck by how he says we have a piece of the truth. We don't have the whole truth. He said in Hinduism, truth is God and God is truth. But I'm not God, so I only have a piece of the truth. That means I've got some of the untruth. Well, why do we struggle? We struggle so I can get my piece of the truth and the opponent can get their piece of the truth out on the table, and we can begin to build a larger truth together. So for me, I would just offer this description of nonviolence that comes out of reflecting and, more importantly, trying to practice what Gandhi and King shared with us. Nonviolence is a spiritual journey, a constructive force, an active method, and a courageous way of life, rooted in the power of love and action that challenges violence without using violence, transforms and resolves conflict, and seeks justice, peace, and reconciliation for all. But it's more than that. It's deeper than that. One way to talk about that depth is nonviolence is a radical engagement with the suffering of our world and all the forms of violence which spawn that suffering. And in this time together at this panel, we're looking at that suffering focused especially on our relationship with the earth and environmental justice. So in light of that, I am reflecting on some experiences that I had around a response to the suffering of the world, specifically a place really not that far away from here in the state of Nevada, 65 miles north of Las Vegas, Nevada, the 1,350 square mile Nevada test site, where between 1951 and 1993, 928 nuclear bombs were exploded. It is considered the most bombed place on the planet. And if we're talking about environmental justice, it's important, first of all, to recognize that woundedness that took place there. The United States has a moratorium on going to what they call full nuclear criticality, going to a full nuclear test. But they do subcritical tests there, and they also perfect drone technology and so on. So it hasn't been closed, but it's in a moratorium. Why? Because there's a comprehensive test ban treaty that happened in the early 1990s, where 182 countries around the world have said we're not going to test nuclear weapons any longer. The United States has never signed that, not as a signatory, has not fully ratified that treaty. The Senate has never done that, but President Clinton signed it, and the United States has maintained a moratorium since then. But how did we get there? We got there because ordinary people like ourselves, like what you're doing in Bayview and Hunter Point, and where a lot of us are very active in the issues that we're working on from a Gandhian and Kingian perspective. We got there because ordinary people came together and said, we're going to withdraw our consent from this. And it started, the modern era of trying to end all nuclear testing began in 1982 when a handful of Franciscan priests, sisters, and lay people from the Catholic faith wanted to mark the 800th birthday of St. Francis of Assisi, and they thought, we've heard about the fact that maybe they're still doing nuclear testing 65 miles from where we live. They lived in Las Vegas, Nevada. And they said, let's go out and pray there and be there. And that's what they did. And then they said, well, let's stay. So they stayed for 40 days. And this led to the development of an organization and a movement called the Nevada Desert Experience. And what were they facing? They were facing three issues. One was existential. What they really felt in the 1980s with the barreling arms race with the then Soviet Union was, this is the end of the world. This is the end of the world. If we allow the continuation of the proliferation of nuclear weapons on first strike capabilities, on hair trigger alerts, we've been lucky to have survived so far, although nuclear weapons, of course, were used in Japan in 1945. But since then, that has not happened. But there's no guarantee that that won't happen. There was an existential threat. They responded to this idea that it was the end of the world, and they wanted to respond to that. The second was environmental. If it's the most bombed real estate on the planet, then it's important to recognize that woundedness to Mother Earth and to respond to it and try to end that with that audacious goal of a handful of people going out and saying, let's try to get a comprehensive test ban treaty, which seems so out of bounds, impossible. But they said, we'll go and see and act, and we'll do it in the spirit of Dr. King and Gandhi. And the third reality that they were facing was racial injustice. This land was properly the home of the Western Shoshone Nation and the Paiute Nation. And in 1863, there was a treaty called the Treaty of Ruby Valley that the United States entered into with the indigenous people there, saying it would allow the United States to cross that land. And they could even have a little place where they could refuel and get water. In 1951, President Truman used that as a pretext for taking over this and creating it as a top secret nuclear facility where every 18 days a nuclear weapon was detonated over those 40 years. So the racial injustice of the Western Shoshone and the Paiute people, and the Nevada Desert Experience began to grow in alliance with the Western Shoshone, who led many rituals on the land. And increasingly, people began to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience, tutored really by Dr. King and Gandhi. And at first, people were receiving, you'd cross the line into the facility, and you'd receive either a few weeks in jail or 3 months in jail. And then that didn't deter people. That's supposed to be what it does, is deter people. No, it brought more people to see the center of, in some sense, the nuclear reality taking place. More and more people came, more and more people were arrested, more and more people filled the jails. And then eventually the very poor county that the test site is in threw up its hands and said, we can't afford to keep jailing these people, so we'll give them tickets and we might actually prosecute them later, But in fact, that's not what happened. And so now thousands of people engaged in civil disobedience at the test site year after year, including in 1988, where 8,000 people in one weekend engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience and were arrested at the test site. And you say, well, if there was very little consequence, what was the good about that? It was great, because it was a kind of kindergarten for social change. It was a kind of school where people were getting the power and the process of doing this. So I would just make a couple of comments about this particular movement. Most people, when it started, did not realize the U.S. was still testing nuclear weapons. They thought that had pretty much ended when the Partial Test Ban Treaty went in 1962, again because of a movement. So one of the goals of the movement was to help alert, educate, win, and mobilize the populace to say that has to end. But actually what's really interesting about the story, and I was able to do a lot of research on this, they didn't really start with a big strategy. They were following in the principles of Gandhi and King, and also St. Francis from 800 years ago. But they didn't really say, well, how is this going to work? What it was, the thing that led to contributing, and I in my book on this, I've helped establish that it really did have an impact on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, that what they did was they were relentlessly persistent. They were relentlessly persistent. For 10 years, they kept going out to the test site, seeing what was happening, withdrawing their consent, risking arrest, spreading the word, building a movement. And they also, in the spirit of those principles I just shared from Dr. King about we're defeating people, or we're defeating injustice, not people, and Gandhi's ideas of the pieces of the truth, they went with one resolve. We're going to try to create a condition where what comes out of this struggle is not just us versus them, between them and the sheriffs or the employees or the guards or the directors at the test site. They wanted to actually create a situation where they did everything they could to keep that sense of us and them from happening. And they went into it with nonviolence training, and they went in with this idea that we're not going to bring the violence to one side of this equation. And because of that, a lot of other people felt really empowered to come. If there isn't going to be any violence, at least from the protest side, we're going to go, and that brought lots of people who wouldn't necessarily get in their cars or take a plane or come from around the world to engage in that action. They wanted to create, in a situation of mega violence, where this testing was going on, they wanted to create, at least from their side, an idea of mega nonviolence, and to challenge the us versus them paradigm, and to reduce the likelihood of violent confrontation. And they also did very dramatic actions. Some people, Daniel Ellsberg, who released the Pentagon Papers, went with a group from Greenpeace when they learned a test was about to happen within like 12 hours. A nuclear bomb was about to go off in one part of the top secret facility. And they went backcountry and had walkie-talkies and satellite phones, and they called the Department of Energy and said, we're standing very close to ground zero. And if you detonate that nuclear weapon, we will be incinerated. And they actually, they called people in the US Congress to tell them this. And then the Congress basically called the test site and said, hold off. And it held it off for 3 days. But I wanted to end my remarks with some comments from one of the organizers. Her name is Ann Simmons Bucher, and just by accident or serendipity, she's actually at this conference, and I ran into her earlier, and then I said, oh, I'm going to share this reflection. She was one of the organizers, and she said, she described what they were trying to do there. I have become wholly convinced that something is happening at the test site which is difficult, if not impossible, to articulate. It is, however, experienced. I have witnessed time and again people participating in the vigil and going home changed. Something is happening at the test site, and it is happening not because we are organizationally efficient, but in spite of the fact that we are not. People of faith and goodwill are being drawn together in the Nevada desert, and together they are bringing life and goodness and recreation to a place of evil, death, and destruction. The location is perfect, the vastness of the desert in all of its stark beauty. It is a beauty which is appreciated slowly over a period of time. It is conducive to prayer, meditation, soul-searching, purification. It is as if people are able, in the setting of the desert, to reach down into their depths and discover what is good and what is gift in themselves and in each other. This goodness, this gift, this power, this life force, collectively brought forth, becomes tangible. Bonds are formed. Community happens. Love is made real. And she's also not talking just among themselves, also with people who actually worked at the test site. And out of this love, we are able to confront the evil in the desert. Out of this love, we are able to heal ourselves, each other, and the earth upon which we stand. And because of this love, nuclear weapons testing will end. She said this about 10 years before it did end, or at least there's a moratorium. There hasn't been a test since 1992. It did end. NDE's commitment to ongoing action in season and out contributed to a political groundswell, which was key to the establishment of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and a U.S. moratorium on testing. The shift was the result of many important, clear, and defined strategies, but also the result of their unstrategic strategy of active and creative Kingian and Gandhian love and action.
Thank you. My name's Parwana, and I just want to thank all of you for being here and for being part of the discussion. So I work at the Greenlining Institute. I'm a policy in the Environmental Equity Department. I'm a policy fellow. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about my upbringing and my background because I think it's important for understanding where I approach environmental justice, environmental equity work that I'm doing now. So my environmental awakening started with my first introduction to the outdoors. And by that I mean outdoor recreation in its purest form. So camping, running on trails. And my environmentalism has grown over the years to be intersectional and inclusive. But more importantly, over the last 2 years, it has grown to adopt a more equity and justice lens, which is really important for me. So I was first introduced to the outdoors during a really formative time of my life. I was 12 years old. My family and I had just immigrated to the US from Pakistan. But I'm not from Pakistan. We were living there as refugees for 9 years. I'm originally from Afghanistan. I was born in Kabul in the midst of violence and really not great of times. So anyways, we fled Afghanistan. I grew up in a mostly refugee populated community in Pakistan until the age of 10 or 11, where we moved to the US through the United Nations Refugee Resettlement Program. And by just chance, we were located in the Bay Area. So I grew up around the South Bay, around San Jose, went to high school, and then went to college in Maine at a small liberal arts school called Colby College. When I first moved here, I didn't speak any English, and like many other first-generation immigrant, the obstacles to kind of starting a new life are really kind of endless. But I was the youngest of my siblings. It was my 4 siblings and my mom, and I really kind of didn't really have a grasp of really what my mother was going through. I have so much respect and so much admiration for all first-generation immigrant parents. They go through so much and they sacrifice so much just to give their kids more chances than they had themselves. So, anyways, like, so just growing up as a teenager, straddling two cultures and trying to figure out who I am, but also being told at home that I was being Americanized too fast, Westernized too fast, and then at school where I'm like not American enough, or I'm the foreign kids, just kind of trying to figure all this was a lot for a 12-year-old Parwana at the time. And it was around the same time that I was introduced to the outdoors by new friends we made here in the US. And so they introduced me to things like camping and backpacking, which was kind of like totally new to me and my family. Frankly, my mom didn't really understand why I enjoyed it so much. I don't know, from her perspective, she had a really hard life, so she just like didn't get why I would subject myself to sleeping on the dirt floor and eating sparse meals so I could be in the magic of the outdoors. And I can totally understand where she comes from. But at the same time, I really took to the outdoors as like a space to recreate. And in retrospect, it had really profound impact on my personal and my physical growth. And it was also the one space in that time in my life where I didn't have to be, where I didn't have to try to be enough of one thing or another. I could just be myself and just be a kid in the outdoors. It was liberating. And so when it was time to go off to college, which happened with the help of a lot of people, and also my own hard work, I decided to go to college in the East Coast. I went to Maine at a small liberal arts school, and so at 18, you have to decide what to major in. So I was like, oh, my personal interest, outdoors. So I decided environmental policy out of my love for the outdoors and my concern for the health of the planet. And so over the course of the 4 years, I learned a lot. It's a good program. However, by the time I graduated, I became really kind of, I wasn't able to kind of figure out why it was that I even decided on this major. And I think it was for a few different reasons. There's the lack of diversity in the faculty teaching the courses in the environmental studies department. It was isolating to constantly have to be like the voice of diversity to speak on behalf of a community or speak on behalf of an entire country sometimes. And also the curriculum of the department was just kind of not very inclusive. We studied a lot of global, local environmental challenges, but it's more kind of from the perspective of like tons of GHGs or more kind of natural resource conservation, which I think is important, and I respect people who do that work, but I just like, it was not connecting with me. It wasn't, the things I was studying in my major weren't issues that my communities, the one I grew up in the Bay Area as well as abroad, weren't the issues that they were facing. So it's just like the human piece, the human story, the human connection wasn't there. And so by the time I graduated, I really was not sure if I was gonna stay in the same field or not. So when I graduated, I was able to get a Watson Fellowship, which allowed me to study a project of my own choosing for a year. So I traveled after graduation and I studied midwifery models of care. I don't have any background in health or any clinical skills, but I was like, this is something that's really interesting. And my grandmother was a midwife. I was born at home by her, so it was also, in a way, kind of honoring her memories. I came out of my Watson year just kind of seeing these really massive, like, global challenges firsthand. I was studying a lot. My years was spent living with midwives and shadowing and kind of learning about their narratives of why they decided to go in the field and the challenges facing the field. I was really lucky to have that opportunity in retrospect. And so I finished my Watson year and I came back to the Bay Area and I really needed to figure out what to do, find a job, do something. I didn't have money to go for further studies, which I don't think you need to. I mean, I might at some point, but I'm not sure right now. Anyways, so I was really kind of lost. It took me a while, but I found a job at Grid Alternatives, which is a solar nonprofit based in Oakland, although they have, it's a national organization at this point, they have international offices, but it's mostly, they have 8 regional offices in California. And so Grid, my work at Grid was the first time where I was working at an environmental organization that was more diverse than traditional environmental organizations. And also, Grid Alternatives works at the intersection of social justice and environmental justice, recognizing that you can't do one without the other holistically. And so I spent a year there implementing the single-family solar program. So I was helping low-income folks around the Bay Area, Richmond, Hunters Point, Oakland, apply for no-cost solar systems. And the money for the program I was implementing in part comes from California climate investment, so mainly cap and trade. So the money that comes from funding big polluters, we're putting it back into low-income disadvantaged communities in the Bay Area. And also, the Grid also provides job training for the solar industry. So it's not only enough that you're putting solar, but also you should train folks from the community to be able to take part in this up-and-coming industry that's growing. So that was the first time where I was working in a place where I was like, okay, this fits with my values, and it's an environmental field. So it was, I had a change of, I had an awakening of my kind of environmentalism at that point. And so, but working to implement this program with like really rigid rules and structures, I kind of started to wonder what it would be like to be on the policy side of it. It was great to be able to serve people and like install solar panels on homes, but at the end of the day, there were kind of rules I had to implement that were just kind of made arbitrarily by a bunch of policymakers sitting in Sacramento and deciding what the cutoff for low income would be for a family of 5. So it was really painful sometimes to tell a family with 3 little kids, like, oh, I'm sorry, we can't serve you this year. You make $2,000 over the limit of what these policymakers consider low income. So I left Grid to pursue to work on the policy side of things. So I have been at the Greenlining Institute, which is a racial and economic justice organization, also based in Oakland. The organization started in 1993 as a coalition. It has over the years grown to be the organization that it is now. And at Greenlining, we envision a nation where race is never a barrier to economic opportunity, and that communities of color thrive in the face of climate disasters worsening. That not only that they can survive, but that they can bounce back when disaster hits. But like the big question is, how do you do that? And so the name of Greenlining Institute, the name comes from the practice of redlining. How many people in the room have heard of redlining or know what it is? Yeah, so we work to undo the harmful impacts of redlining, which persists today in the low-income communities of color that we serve. Redlining started after the Great Depression. So the federal government, there was all this, they made money available to financial institutions to help folks to bounce back from the Depression. And so there was all this money. However, redlining, financial institutions, the way they kind of navigated things was they created maps and they put lines around different neighborhoods based on how much of a credit risk there would be. And redlining restricted low-income communities of color from accessing economic opportunities, such as home ownership, owning businesses, building wealth, you name it. So this practice technically became outlawed with the 1968 Fair Housing Act of 1968. However, if you look at redlining maps and you look at the maps of the Bay Area, so Oakland, Richmond, Hunters Point, you can see still where these disparities persist. So like from the levels of the air quality to like access to public transit, if you put the maps on top of one another, you can see it's still the same areas that are facing disproportionate impacts, whether it's the siting of toxic industries or highways running through neighborhoods. And so the low-income communities of colors and neighborhoods suffer from insufficient, unsafe infrastructure, public transit, green spaces to recreate. And so in the face of climate change and worsening climate disasters, also these same communities have the least resources to be able to deal with the impact. So at Greenlining, we're trying to work at the policy level to make sure that money coming in from climate investments are being put back into these communities. It's not only enough that we fund polluters and reduce GHGs, but at the end of the day, at the community level, are those communities seeing the benefits directly? And so the model that we follow for change at Greenlining is first research. We do our research to influence policies that we think will advance equity, but also to oppose policies that we think will minimize equity or to even harm communities. And then with that research, we create policies that are informed by the research. So we go to Sacramento a lot and meet with legislators. And then the next piece is implementation. So laws are only as good as the implementation. We work with agencies in charge of the grants to make sure that the equity lens is there. And then lastly, we amplify our work and make sure that we communicate our findings to the stakeholders. Yeah, so that's where I am right now. And it's been a journey and I'm learning, but I'm committed to serving the communities like the ones I came from, both in the Bay Area, but also abroad in Pakistan. Yeah.
Thank you so much for those opening remarks. I'd like to start our discussion by continuing to help ground our audience in the topic that we're discussing today. So environmental justice, especially if you're not directly and actively involved in the work, the phrase has the potential to become a buzzword, like many other green buzzwords. You know, we talk about green, we talk about sustainability, renewables, things like that. But what rings true in so much of your work, in the remarks that you just gave us, is that a lot of what's important about environmental justice is the way that it answers back to those traditional ways of thinking about environmental action and environmental activism. I think on top of that, there's plenty to talk about in terms of how interdisciplinary environmental justice work can be and how it also answers back to the ways environmental work is often siloed into sort of its own activism sector that doesn't touch, tangible human lives in the way that you all just described. So from your perspectives, if you could continue to illuminate for us, you've collectively, we see here environmental justice work from the grassroots level all the way up through academia, and that looks different in those different places. So if you could, continue to speak to your experiences in this realm, and help us answer some of these misconceptions of what environmental justice is.
So, misconceptions. Yes, environmental justice can definitely be a buzzword. It is very interdisciplinary. It's looking, I would say, at the whole picture, not only from my lens, at least. Okay, yes, we have a facility, it's polluting, all that, but we're also in a community that maybe struggles to put food on the table, maybe struggles to pay rent. So, environmental issues, unless you're very sensitive, have asthma, etc., you don't see a lot of the effects with environmental issues until maybe 20, 30, 40 years later. So from being on the ground, sometimes it's hard to relay how important environmental issues are, even to the community who is like, but are you gonna give me and my family dinner tonight? Because that's what I'm worried about. And to even relay that it's all connected, right? Like environmental justice or environmental racism is just as potent and is just as important as the economic racism or justice that we're seeing in these communities, or food justice. A lot of these communities also don't have a grocery store or have one. Your environment is your environment. It's not just trees and soil and air. It's also, the roof over your head. It's also, being healthy in your home. So for me, I've been a part of organizations that, deal with mainly, pollution and stuff like that. But when we approach that, we also have to not only recognize, but also work with other organizations, other people that are fulfilling also the other injustices, in order to really get people, because in order to get people really wild up and educated about, your environment matters too. Your kid going to the hospital for asthma is just as important as your food on the table. So I don't know if I answered any question, but that's kind of what I think of in terms of interdisciplinary and kind of misunderstandings of environmental justice.
I think from the way I understand, environmental justice very much, I think the most important, distinguishing thing that sets environmental justice apart from, say, traditional environmental movement in the U.S. is very much that the broadening the definition of what the environment is, right? Environment's anywhere where we live, work, sleep, but also recreate. And so allowing for a broader definition of that is, I think, what sets it apart. And then also, I think just environmental justice is more kind of primarily concerned with removing the environmental bads. So whether it's toxic facilities or unequal burdens. And then environmental equity, on the other hand, is making sure environmental benefits reach underserved communities of color. Not always the same, but also I think the other important thing about environmental justice as a movement in the U.S. is very much the grassroots part of it, right? Of low-income communities of color coming together and saying that we get to decide what the issues are and what we're gonna work on. The right to self-determination, I think, is the most important part of it. Making sure that communities that have been historically excluded and that their voices are heard, and that their voices are there from the very beginning of like the visions and goals to the like if the I was just thinking of working at Grid last year and the solar program I was implementing. It's like if there had been people at the table discussing, people from the community discussing, oh, what constitutes low income, there probably would have been a broader, more forgiving definition of what that is, or just not based on drawing a line on a map and saying, oh, if you make $50,000 with a family of 5, then you're considered low income. Yeah, I think representation probably at its roots the most important part.
I'm very moved by the work that my colleagues are doing, because this is crucial and essential that on the ground, where we are, responding, and the kind of inclusiveness you're talking about. I would make these connections to the case that I brought in my remarks around what happened at the Nevada test site. Nobody asked the Western Shoshone, do you think it's a good idea to put a bombing range, a proving ground, on 1,350 square miles of what has been your traditional ancestral home? There is evidence that the Shoshone had been there at least 10,000 years. There was no consultation when that was decided at the higher echelons of U.S. government power and signed off on by President Truman. And I go back to these, the challenges they faced. They saw an existential threat, the end of the world. That's what drew people out there. They saw it as the most bombed place on the planet, the environmental destruction, that woundedness. And third, the racial injustice of what happened to those who have considered this home. And also their job is to maintain the sanctity of that home. This is what we were told many, many times by the leaders and members of the Western Shoshone Nation and people. But in a way, those categories are as active today regarding how the planet, the situation that the planet faces. We have an existential threat. This may be the end of the world unless we take the steps that are necessary to respond to the climate crisis in an inclusive way. It's definitely at the end of the world for some populations around the planet already. And who is including them in the kinds of conversations that Parwana's talking about should happen and that are necessary to plotting a way forward. It won't, we hope, the answer will not come up from a few, especially white people, sitting in a room deciding, well, this is the way to solve the climate crisis. The existential threat, of course, the environmental threat. We're not just talking about a particular part of the state of Nevada, we're talking about the planet. And then, of course, these questions of a racial injustice that are implicated at every level of the climate crisis and must be part of the solution.
Thank you so much. Ken, something I really appreciated about your statements just now is the urgency, the fact that you talk about this as being an existential threat, especially for those communities who are already most at risk, most marginalized. So, going off of that, I'd like us to discuss, in light of our setting today, how each of your work, what lessons are there to be learned from your work, rooted in the principles and methods of Gandhi and Dr. King's focus on nonviolence. What lessons are there from your work? And whether you think moving forward that nonviolent action is the route that we can use to indicate that urgency, because there's, what we're talking about existential threats, and we look at the ways, the different ways that activism has taken shape, and what has produced the quickest change in different situations. We start to wonder, like, are our methods enough? So if you could speak on that, I'd love it. Thank you.
Gandhi and Dr. King, nonviolence, I think, has been pretty much the standard for environmental movements, at least from what I've been a part of. I even think it is also something that has really shown, even within our communities, different ways to go about things, right? Sometimes when you're dealing with a low-income community, there's violence within that community. And so to be able to bring youth in, bring adults into those in those decision-making tables, doing public comments or going up to government agencies and speaking their truth, I think that in of itself is the kind of root of nonviolence, and is able to show the broader community that you can get things done, right? You can heal through nonviolence. I also forgot in my opening remarks to respect the fact that we are on Ohlone land. Just want to put that out there as well. When we talk about environmental healing, justice, peace, I think it really does come from love and connection. Even when we're fighting these facilities, some community members work at those facilities. My goal is not to put you out of a job, right? It is to find a way that we can all just live in a healthier environment. Even Bayview Hunters Point deserves to be just as healthy as Sunset District. It is about human connection. It's about, meeting with people and having the right people, and not necessarily the white people, sitting at the same table and discussing how we got here, discussing and healing the injustices of how we got here and how we can move forward. So Gandhi and Dr. King, like I said, really kind of created that standard for how we approach things in the movement from what all the things that I've done.
Thank you. We're here at Stanford affirming the legacies of these tremendous organizers and visionaries. But I would maybe say something provocative. I think we're at the beginning of what Dr. King and Mohandas Gandhi brought. We've been getting our training over these decades, over this last century, but now we must see the emergence of the greatest movement in human history in order to help see the well-being of the creatures on this planet and the human species. It's our greatest challenge in human history. And one reason I am so happy to be here is to see this as an opportunity for us to really bring both our appreciation for all the struggle and all the ways justice and peace building and environmental healing have been going on, and to put our minds and thoughts and spirits together and our gumption and commitment to being part of. I'm not saying we're building it, it's already starting to build, but we to be part of the greatest movement in human history. Everything has to change now. And what I'm appreciating from my colleagues on this panel is helping to reframe. It's not a simple idea about environmentalism. It really is about equity. It is about all of us being at the table, not some of us being at the table, especially communities of color and people who have been excluded, marginalized. It's about also, that movement will include lots of very concentrated campaigns and movements in Bayview and Hunters Point, in various parts of California, in various parts of the United States. In fact, it should be happening everywhere, since that kind of environmental racism is really everywhere in a lot of ways. So both of those things, the grand movement, I'm hoping we have a gathering in 5 years here where we can compare notes and to see what's the status of that greatest movement in human history. It's already starting, and we can all throw so much into it, but also what's happened at Hunters Point, what's happened on the question of equity in California and beyond, and in Pakistan. All of that. I'm very moved, but I feel my own challenge, a challenge to me, to all of us. How can we be part of that? How can we bring everything we have to it? And how can we be together and make sure those who have been most impacted are able to have, in a sense, first position in terms of making those changes happen?
I think when framing the discussion around like the urgency of climate change, it's like, so what do we want? I think like what we are looking to do is to go from this exploitative, extractive, fossil fuel-based economy to one that's regenerative and inclusive and healing. That's a lofty goal. Like, how do we do that with the urgency, right? So I think we're at a point where it's like we should use every tool available to us to get there, and nonviolent civil disobedience being one of them. I think that environmental organizations should all have clear statements about what their organization-based policy is around their employees engaging in that. Not that it should be expected of you, but if you're willing to do that at advocacy, I think institutions and organizations should provide support for you to take part in that. But also recognizing that it's also like if you are privileged enough to do that, because in this country, different races have different relationships with law enforcement and police, and so also recognizing that if you're privileged enough, go ahead and do it. I remember the president of Sierra Club, Carl, anyways, at one of the climate marches, he got arrested, and so being a white man in a position of power, that made headlines in newspapers. Like, I'm all for that. I think we should use it whenever we need to amplify a message, and whenever we need to bring attention to an issue. Yeah.
That's great.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for this continued discussion on like the importance of that the very character of environmental justice movements is a grassroots one, and the ways that that makes the concept and the movement particularly accessible and applicable to communities of color, low-income communities, especially indigenous communities. So thank you, Dalila, for that land acknowledgement. So, you know, in light of that grassroots focus, all of you in your work have had to also contend with taking that grassroots action and hopefully instituting policy change, working you know, across different sectors to make sure that the change that you're advocating for is institutionalized. So I'm curious from your different perspectives, what effect you've seen the environmental justice movements have had in influencing policy change, and specifically, or more broadly, in influencing policy and action in climate change.
It absolutely has influenced policy. At least on the grassroots level, I think, you know, when communities demand to be heard, that automatically changes policy, right? Because if you didn't even know they existed before, you do now, right? So that changes the way, I hope, you kind of approach things. But when you talk about, you know, petitions, protesting a certain policy, we've had, you know, community members gather around along with organizations to write new policies, to write new legislations, with some help of really great lawyers that do pro bono work. So, yeah, you know, nonviolent civil disobedience, like, I think it truly is the way to get things done in terms of not only in the media, but also behind closed doors. And that approach that you absolutely have to do both. You cannot kick and scream and not do anything else. That's been kind of proven that doesn't get you quite anywhere. That's how you become just the anger group. So, you know, working all together really does get things moving. In terms of climate change, I personally don't think we have time to figure out how to make it convenient for us. We don't have time. I personally think the Earth gonna be okay. She's fine with or without us. But I think something to think about when it comes to climate change is are we prepared to have less convenience in order to benefit the Earth and to benefit us in general. And that is a scary conversation, right? Even as an environmentalist, what am I gonna do without my phone, like my computer? You know, the AC, like there's convenience things in place that, you know, we've just really gotten used to. And we might have to get used to that, either by force or by our own volition. So, you know, yeah.
I think that we're in California, so California is a leader in kind of shaping policy at the national level, whatever, like what California does sometimes the rest of the country follows, especially on climate change. The state has made really ambitious goals around mitigating climate change. So cap and trade being kind of the example that most people point to as an example of success. And so now there's all this money coming in the billions of dollars from cap and trade. So the question is, how do we best use that to mitigate impacts of climate change, but also to build resiliency for the most vulnerable parts of the population in kind of dealing with worsening climate disasters. I think that, I don't know, there's a lot of equity washing happening around this kind of stuff. So organizations claiming that equity is their goal, but once you kind of look through their material with a fine closer, there isn't really mentions of how they're trying to include equity, how to make sure that their programs and grants are equitable. So Greenlining recently published, my colleague Sona, a report on how to operationalize equity in programs and policies. If you are working in the environmental field or any other field, it's a really accessible, user-friendly framework for how you can operationalize equity in your work. It's available online. If you go to the Greenlining website, you can download the whole report. And it goes in a lot of detail, but I'm just gonna talk a little bit about kind of the framework and why it's important. So the framework is more kind of how to operationalize equity in climate adaptation and resilience. And basically, the most important part of it is that when thinking about how to apply the framework, there's 4 clear steps outlined. So first, you have to make sure that equity is embedded in the goals, missions, visions of whatever it is that you're doing, whatever work you're doing. So you have to in order to include that in your mission and vision, you have to know what the problems are, what the challenges are, and in order to do that, you have to invite the community to the table to have a good idea of what the challenges are. And then you have to be specific about what vulnerable populations you're talking about. And then equity has to be built into the processes. And this is where community engagement piece comes in. You need to learn about priorities of the community, what the challenges they're facing, and how to best answer that. And it has to be a community decision, right? And then also you have to make sure that equity is there in the implementation in order to see it in the outcome. So this is especially applicable for grant programs. And then lastly, you have to measure and analyze for equity to see if the goals you set out were achieved or not. I don't know, I think that's just one part of kind of how you can make sure that the equity is included in the policy piece of how you're addressing climate change impacts.
Thank you. I would just add this. We're asking, what have you seen in terms of policy impacts? So the French, before the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, regularly detonated nuclear weapons in Tahiti. The Soviet Union regularly detonated nuclear weapons both in the Arctic Circle and in Kazakhstan. And of course, the United States, hundreds of detonations right next door to California, with all kinds of impacts that we don't still understand. So some of those impacts of getting a comprehensive test ban is those immediate endings of those immediate harmful situations. I would just say this, that I go with the thought of James Douglas, who's written quite a few books on nonviolent resistance. He believes that nonviolence creates time. I first experienced that in the 1980s when we were trying to stop the barreling arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States. And there was a movement in this country that actually changed the terms of the debate around that and actually created the conditions for arms control agreements, even though the government didn't want to do them. The movement led that and made that happen. And it created the space and time to actually have rational decision-making around that, leading to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. I have that same thought even in the dire situation that we face. And we saw that with Greta Thunberg and others recently with the global climate strike. It fixes our attention, it concentrates the mind, and it says, we've got to really deal with this. It opens the space and time for that. I think that's what's possible. It doesn't mean it will happen. But I actually think the work that you're doing is contributing mightily to how we're going to actually have to approach either mitigation or actually really dealing with the climate crisis. It's got to have these kinds of very concrete notions about equity, and it's got to be also part of it, these kinds of very neighborhood-based grassroots efforts to get to a better world.
Okay, thank you so much. So I appreciate you bringing up the global climate strike, Ken, and I appreciate the way that you described, like again, going back to the theme of urgency, the way that this, relatively quickly, this movement has captured global attention. But we recognize, especially in the ways we've been talking about environmental justice on this panel, some of the critiques that movement has gotten for continuing to elevate voices of white environmental activists and what effects that could potentially have, or the ways that we are not paying the same attention to communities of color, low-income communities, marginalized communities. So from there, I want us to think about, in the ways we've been talking about the history of environmental justice. We recognize it in the United States as a lot of the way the movement is today. We can thank the civil rights movement for. And I'm thinking particularly of Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign and the ways that tied working conditions, economic injustices directly to minority communities' experiences of space, and what a special movement that was to highlight the need for cross-racial solidarity and solidarity across minority groups in fighting this fight. So I'm curious to hear in your work where you've seen those opportunities for cross-racial or cross-minority group solidarity, and what effect does that have on your work that wouldn't be there otherwise?
So I think it's really important to have cross-racial solidarity within communities of color, at least in Bayview, Bay Area. You already have a lot of different racial groups, right? You have African American, Latino, even Polynesian, Asian, et cetera, and what I like about about EJ is that, environmental justice, is that it does affect everybody, right? No matter who you are. Air pollution doesn't discriminate based on your skin color. If you're in it, you're in it. And what I like about that is it brings different people internally together, right? Because sometimes we're living in the same community, but maybe we don't talk to each other, or we do. But it definitely gives you a concentrated space to be like, we all have this in common. there's no, oh, you have this more or you have this less. You know, my kid has asthma, your kid has asthma. So I think it's very, very important. I don't think you can have I don't think you can have environmental justice without it. You need solidarity on every level. I think you need it cross-racial, you need it cross-class, you need it, you need everybody to make it work, and to get a goal accomplished. Where I've seen it, obviously I've just seen it in the communities that I've lived, the communities that I've served, and I've seen how powerful that can be, and how desegregating that can be, because you have one community, but you have factions of that community, right? East Palo Alto, as I was growing up, we literally called different sections of a 2.5 square mile city different things. You had, if you were south of Bay Street, you were the Ville. If you were north, you had the Green, the Gardens. Then you had the Mid, right? So, and when you're talking about communities of color too, there's, let's just say it, you have different gangs maybe, different, just different things. And so environmental justice I've found is kind of the equalizer. It brings everybody to the table under one thing, and you really get to know people, and it breaks down, the whatever notions you had about either that race or that class or that certain type of people, or and so that's been really rewarding for me to see. It's also something I can really take in my work now, serving in a community that I don't live in, which is a different experience. And even me knowing, hey, this flyer needs to be translated, and this, we can't, you have to walk your talk, right? How are we going to be mad at, the Navy not translating their meeting notices when we don't translate our flyers? So it just brings different perspectives. It brings different, and it just changes your whole kind of outlook on just human connection, and how much we need each other. Yeah.
I think that is the fact that environmental justice movement was, I think it's a multi-ethnic coalition. It's whether it was, I don't know, thinking of kind of bringing it back to like more recent examples of kind of movements and communities, indigenous, Black, Asian communities coming together and marching, or whether it was the Dakota Access Pipeline or Warren County in North Carolina, primarily an African American community putting their bodies in line so that they wouldn't store toxic soil in their backyard. I think that is its strength, that it's a multi-ethnic movement and coalition. But I think that in part, the environmental justice movement came about because traditional, long-standing environmental organizations weren't including those folks, right, and the concerns that they had. So I think, I don't know, for me, kind of thinking about it organizationally within all these existing environmental organizations, I think we need to, I wish there was more kind of collaboration between environmental justice, environmental equity organizations with those, say like NRDC or the Sierra Club that have been around for a lot longer, that have more money, more resources, more know-how and capacity. I think there needs to be more collaboration between them. And frankly, I think environmental organizations that have been around longer need to not only make sure that the hierarchy of their leadership is more diverse and inclusive, but also that the issues that they're addressing, issues faced by communities of color, low-income communities, indigenous communities all over the U.S.
Yes to all of that. I don't think we get to the greatest movement in human history unless that kind of what Dr. King called the beloved community, where everybody is allies. I would just maybe close my remarks with, you mentioned the Poor People's Campaign, and in preparation for that campaign, Dr. King wrote a book called Trumpet of Conscience, and in there he has this quote that has stayed with me all these years, which is, there's nothing wrong with a traffic signal that has a red light. But when there's an emergency, the ambulance goes right through that red light. And if we are in the midst of an emergency, then we have the right to go through those red lights at top speed. The world needs brigades of ambulance drivers to go through those red lights at top speed until the emergency is solved. And I'm happy to be with some of the ambulance drivers here today.
Okay, thank you so much for this engaging discussion and for illuminating to us further the importance of your work. Again, it's truly an honor to be up here with you. I'd like to open the floor to maybe one or two audience questions.
I will bring the microphone if someone has a question.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful comments. That was a wonderful discussion. You have already touched on it in talking about the president of the Sierra Club, who used his privilege to empower his goals and that of the communities he works with. And I want to hear more of your thoughts on the role of active allyship in the environmental justice movement. If one is passionate about working on environmental and justice goals and empowering the communities that are most deeply impacted, but oneself does not identify with that population or region or community, what might that look like?
I think, so in my work, we'll go meet a lot of legislators and just policymakers in general, and we'll talk to them about how they can best center equity in their line of work. And so we'll usually the starting point for conversations will be redlining and harmful impacts of redlining and working to undo that through policy and program work. And I think, in my experience, just as soon as you bring the word equity, people start getting defensive. It's it's as though you're accusing them of like not doing enough. So I think being part of being a good ally is listening to understand and asking questions. But I do think that it's important that if you're not part of that community, you should definitely work to be an ally and amplify their voice, right? So, but like, how do you do that? You do that by listening and by engaging and by showing up, because trust is built. Trust takes time. Earning someone's trust, earning a community's trust, it takes time. You have to show up and do the work before they can trust you. So I don't know, even as like someone who goes into communities that I didn't really necessarily grow up in, but trying to work, it's totally legitimate for the community to be like, why should we let you do the work? You're not from here. So I think doing your homework, showing up, is doing the dirty work first is really important part of building allyship, and I think that could probably be applied beyond the environmental field as well.
I say yes to that.
I also agree with that. Yeah, being on the ground, showing up, going to community meetings, knowing maybe who community leaders are, community organizations, showing up at church, showing up, where people congregate. I think showing your face, listening, understanding where people are coming from, understanding different perspectives of where people are coming from, because in the same community, people have different perspectives, different thoughts of how to handle things, different perspectives on what's important to work on too. The community does, piggybacking off of what she said, the community does have to let you know what they want. And you have to listen, and not only listen, but understand, and then take that understanding into how you approach your work. And always keeping that in mind. I think when you're working with a community, you're really working for that community. They ultimately should have the say of how you do things. They should always be at the table. They should always be in the forefront of your mind whenever you're doing anything. So yeah.
Okay, maybe one final question.
Hello, thank you all for sharing your thoughts today. It's been great. This question is directed towards Ken, but the other panelists are definitely welcome to chime in. Ken, you used the phrase us versus them paradigm. I was hoping you could just kind of explain what that is and maybe its implications on creating a more cooperative society.
Yeah, that's the paradigm that we're rooted in, often socialized into. And I think that's one of the great contributions of Gandhi, was he's questioning that sense that of us versus them, that we are unified, we are connected. He had a great phrase, difference without division. So we have differences, they're very beautiful and important. When I'm looking this way, I see the world slightly differently from when I would look over here. And there are 7 billion of us who are looking in different directions, and yet we are all one. And so that's what I think, as I said in the story about the Nevada Desert experience, they wanted to experiment with that. How can we do this in a way that doesn't go in that direction, that actually does say we're going to transform us versus them thinking? It's these two hands of nonviolence. On the one hand, I will not cooperate with your injustice, but I'm open to you as a human being. And in that movement, they actually went through a whole lot of processes of trying to talk with the leadership at the test site, but also just the way they behaved. So on the very first day, one of the organizers thought, well, the only way you actually make social change is to create a conflict. And so if things are really dead, I'm going to be splashing a lot of blood everywhere. The sheriffs will jump in and get very riled up, and then we'll have this back and forth, and we'll get on the front page of the local paper. And so things were pretty mellow that first day, this vigil, all these 8,000 workers coming in out there in the middle of the desert. And this person named Mike Affleck decided, oh, you know, this is not social change. So he goes to his car to get this big jar of blood that he had actually prepared so that he could splash it around and it would be this kind of polarizing thing. And somehow the lid on the blood had come off, and it was all in his back seat. And he didn't have anything to really just galvanize this kind of active and potentially violent sort of action to get the... So he had to go back and get a sign and hold it. And if you really study that movement, they reflected on that and said, no, we're going to go in another direction. And what happened was it really did create the conditions where if the sheriffs began beating people, which they would do, the top sheriff would come along and say, that's not what we do here, because these people are being nonviolent. It's very strange, but very powerful. But most importantly, it created the possibility for lots of people to come to the test site, and I think contributed to ultimately the people power that was necessary for the comprehensive test ban. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. If y'all would please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists. Thank you for joining us today. Please enjoy the rest of the conference.